In this video, we'll learn about Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP. And here we see our familiar network diagram that we've used for many of our lessons. Now, one of the key elements of this diagram is the fact that these computers all have IP addresses. Well, that's great. They do all have IP addresses, but how did they get those IP addresses? There's a couple different ways that IP addresses can be assigned to these computers. So the first option is to manually configure static IP addresses for my computer. So here you can see in Windows, I've launched my control panel, and I'm just going to configure the IP address for my computer. So I'm going to go under Network and Internet. And under Network and Internet, I'm going to change my adapter settings. And I'm just going to pick my physical Ethernet adapter here. And under that physical Ethernet adapter, I'll click Properties. And here is my TCP/IP stack. And so I'll click on that, and then I'll click on Properties, and notice what's configured here. Right now, it says Obtain an IP address automatically. But if I want to, I could manually configure an IP address. So if I know which IP this computer is supposed to get, I could always configure that here. The downside of this approach is that typically, in most organizations, it's going to be a lot of work to kind of continuously set up the IP addresses of every single computer manually. And when we start dealing with virtual machines, that becomes nearly impossible. So most organizations, you will see this little option here checked. Obtain an IP address automatically and obtain a DNS server automatically. Those options are selected because we're using a DHCP server. So here we are back at our diagram, and let's assume that in this case, we're booting up computer 1, and it currently does not have an IP address, but it is set up for DHCP. Well, it's going to go through this process of number 1, sending out a broadcast. This is called DHCP Discover. And basically this broadcast is computer 1 saying, hey, I need an IP address. Who's the DHCP server? Can you give me an IP address? And because it's a broadcast, the request hits our DHCP server here in our diagram. And the next step in the process is what we call a DHCP offer. So the server is going to say, oh, you need an IP address? Sure, here's one. I'm going to offer you an IP address. So let's say it offers this machine 10.1.1.11, for example. And if that works, the computer will say, yeah, that's perfect. Let me request that address. It'll send back a little communication to the server, basically saying, yes, I want that. And the server will send back a DHCP acknowledgement saying, that's great. You've got that address, right? So now I can bring up computers on my network that don't have any IP addressing information whatsoever, and they will automatically just obtain it. And there are a few different ways that we can do this. In this diagram, we've got a dedicated DHCP server, but we could also have the router performing this function as well. That's a common configuration also. So DHCP is essentially here to configure much of the stuff that we see when we put in the ipconfig command. And here we see my physical Ethernet adapter. I'm going to get my IP address from my DHCP server. I'm going to get my subnet mask from it. Here you can see the address of the DHCP server, and notice it's the same as my default gateway. My router is acting as my DHCP server in this network. And it's also going to do things like giving us DNS servers as well, domain name service. And we'll talk about those in an upcoming lesson. We'll talk about exactly what DNS does. So DHCP is giving me all of the addressing information that I need here. Now let's clear out the screen. And by the way, if you're not familiar with all of these ipconfig commands, just type in ipconfig space ? And it'll show you all sorts of options that you have available here. And one of the commands is ipconfig /release. And what this command will do is it'll release any DHCP IP addresses that this computer has. So if you want to get rid of the DHCP address that a computer has, you can release it, and then you can also renew it to get a new IP address. So those are some handy little troubleshooting tools. If you think, for example, the DHCP server might be down, you could try a release and renew and see if you get a new IP address. And if you don't, then that's a good indication that the DHCP server might potentially be down. Let's take a moment to review some of the key concepts that we learned during this lesson. And we learned that static IP addresses need to be manually configured, and this can be a lot of work. And so what we might want to do is automate IP address assignment using DHCP. And so when a machine comes up and it issues a DHCP request, it's reaching out to learn which IP address it should use. And that request is a layer 2 broadcast. We learned how in Windows we can use the ipconfig/release command to release the DHCP assigned IP address that my computer might have, and how I can use the ipconfig/renew command to renew or get a new DHCP IP address.